For a company to be a truly worthwhile investment, it must not only be able to sell its products, but also be able to appraise changing needs and desires of its customers, in other words, to master all that is implied in a true concept of marketing. First lessons in the School of Experience. As the summer of 1928 approached and my first year in the business school came to an end, an opportunity arose which seemed to me too good to pass up. In contrast to the hundreds of students that are enrolled each year in this school today, my class, being only the third in the graduate school's history, contained 19 students. The graduating class 1 year ahead of me contained only 9. Just 2 of these 9 were trained in finance. In that day of great stock market ferment, both were snapped up by New York-based investment trusts. At the last minute, an independent San Francisco bank, which years later was acquired by the Crocker National Bank of that city, sent down to the school a request for a graduate trained in investments. The school was anxious not to pass up this opportunity because if their representative merited the approval of the bank, it could be the forerunner of many opportunities for placing future graduates in the years to come. However, they had no graduate to send. It was not easy to do, but when I heard of this opportunity, I finally persuaded the school to send me with the thought that if I were to make good, I would stay there. If I could not fill the job, I would come back and take second-year courses, with the bank realizing that the school had made no pretense of sending them a completely trained student. Security analysts in those pre-crash days were called statisticians. It was 3 successive years of sensationally falling stock prices that were to occur just a short time ahead that caused the work of Wall Street's statisticians to fall into such disrepute that the name was changed to security analysts. I found that I was to be the statistician for the investment banking end of the bank. In those days, there was no legal barrier to banks being in the brokerage or investment banking business. The work I was assigned to do was extremely simple. In my opinion, it was also intellectually dishonest. The investment arm of the bank was chiefly engaged in selling high-interest rate, new issues of bonds on which they made quite sizable commissions as part of underwriting syndicates. No attempt was made to evaluate the quality of these bonds or any stocks. They sold, but rather in that day of a seller's market they gratefully accepted any part of a syndicate offered them by their New York associates or by the large investment banking houses. Then the security salesmen for the bank would portray to their customers that they had a statistical department capable of surveying those customers' holdings and issuing to them a report on each security handled. What was actually done in those security analyses was to look up the data on a particular company in one of the established manuals of the day, such as Moody's or Standard Statistics. Then someone like myself, with no further knowledge than what was reported in that manual, would simply paraphrase the wording of the manual to write his own report. Any company that was doing a large volume of sales was invariably reported as well managed, just because it was big. I was under no direct orders to recommend that customers switch some of the securities one analyzed into whatever security the bank was attempting to sell at the moment, but the whole atmosphere was one of encouraging this type of analysis. Building the basics. It was not very long before the superficiality of the whole procedure caused me to feel that there must be a better way to do this. I was extremely fortunate in having an immediate boss who completely understood why I was concerned and granted me the time to make an experiment which I proposed to him. At that time, in the fall of 1928, there was a great deal of speculative interest in radio stocks. I introduced myself as a representative of the investment arm of the bank to the buyers of the radio department of several retail establishments in San Francisco. I asked them their opinions of the 3 major competitors in this industry. I was given surprisingly similar opinions from each of them. In particular, I learned a great deal from one man who was himself an engineer and who had worked for one of these companies. One company, Philco, which from my standpoint unfortunately was privately owned so that it represented no stock market opportunity, had developed models which had a special market appeal. As a result, they were getting market share at a beautiful profit to themselves because they were highly efficient manufacturers. RCA was just about holding its own market share, whereas another company, which was a stock market favorite of the day, was slipping drastically and showing signs of getting into trouble. None of this was the direct business of the bank, for it was not handling radio stocks. Nevertheless, an evaluative report seemed likely to help me considerably within the bank because many key bank officers who would see it were personally involved in speculation in these issues. Nowhere in material from Wall Street firms who were talking about these hot radio issues could I find a single word about the troubles that were obviously developing for this speculative favorite. In the ensuing 12 months, as the stock market continued on its reckless but merry way with most stocks climbing to new highs, I noticed with increasing interest how the stock I had singled out for trouble was sagging further and further in that rising market. It was my first lesson in what later was to become part of my basic investment philosophy. Reading the printed financial records about a company is never enough to justify an investment. One of the major steps in prudent investment must be to find out about a company's affairs from those who have some direct familiarity with them. At this early point, however, I had not achieved the next logical step in this type of reasoning. It is also necessary to learn as much as possible about the people who are running a company under investment considerations, either by getting to know those people yourself or by finding someone in whom you have confidence who knows them well. As 1929 started to unfold, I became more and more convinced of the unsoundness of the wild boom that seemed to be continuing. Stocks continued climbing to ever higher prices on the amazing theory that we were in a new era. Therefore, in the future, year after year of advancing per-share earnings could be taken as a matter of course. Yet as I tried to appraise the outlook for America's basic industries, I saw a number of them with supply-demand problems that seemed to me to indicate their outlook was getting rather wobbly. In August of 1929 I issued another special report to the officers of the bank. I predicted that the next 6 months would see the beginning of the greatest bear market in a quarter of a century. It would be very satisfying to my ego, if at this point, I could alter drastically the tale of just what happened and leave the impression that, having been exactly right in my forecasting, I then profited greatly from all this wisdom. The facts were quite to the contrary. Even though I felt strongly that the whole stock market was too high in those dangerous days of 1929, I was nevertheless entrapped by the lure of the market. This caused me to look around to find a few stocks that were still cheap and were worthwhile investments because they had not gone up yet. As a result of the small profits from the tiny amount of stock transactions a few years back and the saving of a good part of my salary, plus some money I had earned in college, I managed to scrape together several $1,000s as 1929 went along. I divided this almost equally among 3 stocks which, in my ignorance, I thought were still undervalued in that overpriced market. One was a leading locomotive company with a still quite low price-earnings ratio. With railroad equipment being one of the most cyclical of all industries, it takes very little imagination to see what was to happen to that company's sales and profits in the business depression that was about to engulf us. The other 2 were a local billboard company and a local taxicab company, also selling at very low price-earnings ratios. In spite of my success in ferreting out what was going to happen to the radio stocks, I just did not have the sense to start making similar inquiries from people who knew about these 2 local enterprises, even though obtaining such information or even getting to meet the people who ran these businesses would have been relatively simple, since they were close at hand. As the depression increased, I learned rather vividly why these companies had been selling at such low price-earnings ratios. By 1932, only a tiny percentage of my original investment was represented by the market value of the shares in these companies. The Great Bear Market. Fortunately for my future well-being, I have an intense dislike for losing money. I have always believed that the chief difference between a fool and a wise man is that the wise man learns from his mistakes, while the fool never does. The corollary of this is that it behooved me to go over my mistakes pretty carefully and not to repeat them again. My approach to investing expanded as I learned from my 1929 mistakes. I learned that, while a stock could be attractive when it had a low price-earnings ratio, a low price-earnings ratio by itself guaranteed nothing and was apt to be a warning indicator of a degree of weakness in the company. I began realizing that, all the then current Wall Street opinion to the contrary, what really counts in determining whether a stock is cheap or overpriced is not its ratio to the current year's earnings, but its ratio to the earnings a few years ahead. If I could build up in myself the ability to determine within fairly broad limits what those earnings might be a few years from now, I would have unlocked the key both to avoiding losses and to making magnificent profits. In addition to learning that a low price-earnings ratio was just as apt to be a sign that a stock was an investment trap as that it was a bargain, acute awareness of my miserable investment performances during the Great Bear Market made me vividly aware of something of possibly even greater importance. I had been spectacularly right in my timing of when the bull market bubble was about to burst, and almost right in judging the full force of what was to happen. Yet except for a possible small boost in my reputation among a very small circle of people, this had done me no good whatsoever. From then on, I was to realize that all the correct reasoning about an investment policy or about the desirability or purchase or sale of any particular stock did not have the least bit of value until it was translated into action through the completion of specific transactions. A chance to do my thing. In the spring of 1930 I made a change of employers. I only mention this because it triggered the events that were to cause the emergence of the investment philosophy that has guided me since that time. A regional brokerage firm came to me and made me a salary offer which, at age 22 and for that time and place, I found quite difficult to refuse. Furthermore, they offered me a vastly more appealing work assignment than the dissatisfying experience as a statistician in the investment banking arm of the bank. With no assigned duties whatsoever, I was to be free to devote my time to finding individual stocks which I thought were particularly suitable candidates for either purchase or sale because of their characteristics. I was then to write reports on my conclusions to circulate among the brokers employed by this firm to help them stimulate business that would be profitable for their clients. This offer came to me just after Herbert Hoover had made his famous, "Prosperity is just around the corner," statement. Several partners of the firm involved implicitly believed this. As a result of the 1929 crash, their total payroll had dropped from 125 employees to 75. They told me that if I accepted their offer, I would be number 76. I was just as bearish at the time as they were bullish. I felt sure the bear market was a long way from over. I told them that I would come on one condition. While they were free to fire me at any time if they did not like the quality of my work, lack of seniority must be no influence whatsoever if adverse financial markets forced them to make further reduction in payroll. They agreed to this provision. From disaster, opportunity springs. As employers, I could not have asked for nicer people. In the ensuing 8 months, I had one of the most valuable business educational experiences of my life. I saw at first-hand example after example of how the investment business should not be conducted. As 1930 unfolded and stocks once again continued on what seemed like an almost endless decline, my employer's position got more and more precarious. Then, just before Christmas of 1930, we, who had so far survived the economic holocaust, witnessed the grim picture of the whole firm being suspended from the San Francisco Stock Exchange for insolvency. This grim news for my associates was to prove one of the most fortunate business developments, if not the most fortunate, of my life. For some time I had had vague plans that when prosperity returned I would start my own business by charging clients a fee for managing their investments. I am purposely using this roundabout way to describe the activities of an investment counselor or an investment advisor because in those days neither of these terms had yet been used. However, with almost everyone in the financial business retrenching during that gloomy January of 1931, the only security industry job I could find was a purely clerical and, to me, a quite unattractive one. If I had properly analyzed the situation, I would have realized that this was exactly the right time to start a new business of the kind I had in mind. I was to find that there were 2 reasons for this. One was that, after almost 2 years of the most severe bear market this nation had ever seen, nearly everyone was so dissatisfied with their existing brokerage connections that they were in the mood to listen even to someone both young and advocating a radically different approach to the handling of their investments as was I. Also, as the economy reached its depths in 1932, many key businessmen had so little to do in pursuing their own affairs that they had the time to see someone who was calling on them. In more normal times, I would never have gotten by their secretaries. One of the most worthwhile clients of my entire business career, and a man whose family's investments I still handle, was a typical example of this. Some years afterwards he told me that on the day I called he had had almost nothing to do and had already finished reading the sports section of the newspaper. So when my name and purpose were told him by his secretary, he thought, listening to this guy will at least occupy my time. He confessed, if you had come to see me a year or so later, you never would have gotten into my office. A foundation is formed. All this was to result in several years of very hard work in a tiny office with low overhead. With no windows and merely glass partitions to serve as two of the walls, my total floor space was little larger than that needed to jam together a desk, my chair, and one other chair. For this, together with free local telephone service and a reasonable amount of secretarial help from the secretary receptionist of the gentleman from whom I leased this space, I paid the princely sum of $25 per month. My only other expenses were stationery, postage, and a very occasional long-distance call. The account book still in my possession provides an indication of how difficult it really was to start a new business in 1932. After very long hours of work over and above this overhead, I made a net profit averaging $2.99 per month for that year. In the still difficult year of 1933, I did a trifle better, showing an improvement of just under 1,000%, an average monthly earnings of just over $29. This possibly was about what I would have made as a newsboy selling papers on the street. Yet in what those years were to bring me in the future, they were two of the most profitable years of my life. They provided me with the foundation for an extremely profitable business and with a group of highly loyal clients by 1935. It would be nice if I could claim that it was brilliant thinking on my part that caused me to start my business when I did rather than waiting until better times were to arrive. Actually, it was the unattractiveness of the only job that seemed open to me that pushed me into it. 2. Learning from experience. While I had been working at the bank, I had noticed with considerable interest a news item about the two neighboring San Jose companies that had intrigued me so much during my student days at the Stanford Business School. In 1928 the John Bean Manufacturing Co. and the Anderson Barn Grover Manufacturing Co. had merged with a leading vegetable canning manufacturer, Sprague Cells Corporation of Hoopeston, Illinois, to form a brand new entity called the Food Machinery Corporation. As in other periods of rampant speculation, the nation was in the throes of such a stock-buying mania that the supply of Food Machinery Corporation stock offered for sale rose in price in an attempt to meet the demand. In that same year of 1928, at least 20 other new issues, and perhaps twice that many, were sold by members of the San Francisco Stock Exchange to eager buyers in the Bay Area. The lack of soundness of some of these issues was little short of appalling. An officer of one stock exchange firm, that sold shares in a company that was to sell bottled water from across the Pacific, told me that these shares were sold without a complete set of financial statements in the hands of the underwriters, who had little more than a photograph of the spring from which the water was supposed to come and a minor amount of personal contact with the selling shareholders. In the public mind, the stock of the Food Machinery Corporation was just another of the exciting new offerings of that year, neither significantly better nor worse than the rest. It was offered at a price of $21.50. In those days, pools for the manipulation of shares were entirely legal. A local group with little expertise in running a pool but headed by a man with great enthusiasm for Food Machinery Corporation decided to run an operation in the company's shares. The methods of all these pools were fundamentally similar. The members would sell stock back and forth among themselves at gradually rising prices. All this activity on the stock tape would attract the attention of others, who would then start to buy and take the pool's shares off its hands at still higher prices. Some highly skilled manipulators, some of whom had made many millions of dollars and one of whom, a year or so later, was to offer me a junior partnership, were quite experienced and able practitioners of this rather questionable art. Manipulation was not the objective of the operators of this food machinery pool, however. As the autumn of 1929 was to arrive and stocks were to face the precipice that lay ahead, the pool managed to buy for itself most of the shares that had been offered to the public. Although the quoted price of the food machinery shares at the peak was in the high 50s, there was very little stock in the hands of the public as a result. As in each of the succeeding years the general level of business activities worsened relative to the year before, it was obvious what was to happen to the flotsam and jetsam of small companies that went public in the 1928 excitement. One after another of these companies passed into bankruptcy, with many of the remainder reporting losses rather than profits. The market for the shares of these firms largely dried up. There were one or two companies in this group other than food machinery that were fundamentally both sound and attractive. However, the general public showed no discrimination whatsoever, considering all of them little more than speculative junk. By the time the market was to reach its final low in 1932, and again equal that low at the time of closing of the entire banking system of the country coincidental with the inauguration of Franklin D. Roosevelt on March 4, 1933, food machinery shares were down to a price of between $4 and $5, with the all-time low being 100 shares at $3.34. Food machinery as an investment opportunity. As 1931 unfolded and I cast about seeking an opportunity for my infant business, I looked upon food machinery's situation with increasing excitement. Recognizing the costliness of my not having taken the trouble to meet with and judge the managements of the two local companies in which I had lost such a large percentage of my investment a few years before, I determined never to make this mistake again. The more I got to know the food machinery people, the greater my respect for them grew. Because in many ways this company, as it existed in the depths of the Great Depression, was a microcosm of the type of opportunity one was to seek in the years ahead. It may be helpful to explain just what it was that caused me nearly a half-century ago to see such a future in this particular corporation. Parenthetically and unfortunately, I did not carry my policy of in-depth field analysis through to its logical conclusion in the immediate years. I was less diligent in getting to know and to judge managements that were located in more distant areas. In the first place, even though food machinery was relatively small, it was a world leader in size and, I believe, in quality of the product line in each of the three activities in which it was engaged. This gave the firm the advantage of scale, that is, as a large and efficient manufacturer the firm could also be a low-cost producer. Next, its marketing position was, from a competitive standpoint, extremely strong. Its products were highly regarded by its customers. It controlled its own sales organization. Furthermore, its canning machinery lines, with a large number of installations already in the field, had a locked-up market of some proportions. This consisted of spare and replacement parts for the equipment already in the field. Added to this sound base was the most exciting part of the business. For a company of its size, the firm enjoyed a superbly creative engineering or research department. The company was perfecting equipment in promising new product areas. Among these were the first mechanical pear peeler ever to be offered to the industry, the first mechanical peach pitter, and a process for synthetically coloring oranges. Oranges from areas which produced fruit with the most juice was at a competitive disadvantage because the product looked less attractive to the housewife than other types in which intrinsic quality was no better. At only one other time in my business life have I seen a company which, in my judgment, had on the horizon as big a dollar volume of potentially successful new products in relation to the then existing size of business as was the case with the Food Machinery Corporation in the period from 1932 through 1934. Learning from experience. By this time, I had learned enough to know that, no matter how attractive, such matters by themselves were not sufficient to assure great success. The quality of the people involved in the company was just as critical. I use the word quality to encompass two quite different characteristics. One of these is business ability. Business ability can be further broken down into two very different types of skills. One of these is handling the day-to-day tasks of business with above-average efficiency. In the day-to-day tasks, I include 101 matters, varying all the way from constantly seeking and finding better ways to produce more efficiently to watching receivables with sufficient closeness. In other words, operating skill implies above-average handling of the many things that have to do with the near-term operation of the business. However, in the business world, top-notch managerial ability also calls for another skill that is quite different. This is the ability to look ahead and make long-range plans that will produce significant future growth for the business without at the same time running financial risks that may invite disaster. Many companies contain managements that are very good at one or the other of these skills. However, for real success, both are necessary. Business ability is only one of the two people traits that I believe is absolutely essential for a truly worthwhile investment. The other falls under the general term of integrity and encompasses both the honesty and the personal decency of those who are running a company. Anyone receiving his first indoctrination into the investment world in the period that preceded the 1929 crash would have seen rather vivid examples of the extreme importance of integrity. The owners and managers of a business are always closer to that business's affairs than are the stockholders. If the managers do not have a genuine sense of trusteeship for the stockholders, sooner or later the stockholders may fail to receive a significant part of what is justly due them. Managers preoccupied by their own personal interests are not likely to develop an enthusiastic team of loyal people around them, something that is an absolute must if a business is to grow to a size that one or two people can no longer control. As I saw the situation in those dark days of the Deep Depression, and as I see it now after all these years, this infant food machinery corporation was unusually attractive from the people's standpoint. John D. Crumey, the president and son-in-law of the original founder of the John Bean Manufacturing Co., was not only an extremely efficient operating head and highly regarded by his customers and his employees, but also he was a deeply religious man who scrupulously lived up to a high moral code. The chief engineer of the company was a brilliant conceptual designer. Also of considerable importance, he was a man who designed along lines that would give his products worthwhile patent protection. Finally, to round out the strength of this relatively small organization, John Crumey persuaded his son-in-law, Paul L. Davies, who was reluctant to abandon what appeared to be a most promising career in banking, to join the company to give it financial strength and conservatism. Actually, Paul Davies at first made this move so reluctantly that he only agreed to take a one-year leave of absence from the bank to help his family business over the first rough year of merger. During that year, he became so interested in the exciting prospects that lay ahead that he decided to stay permanently with the company. Later, as its president, he was to lead it to a size and degree of prosperity that was to dwarf the pleasing accomplishments of the next few years. This then was a company that inherently had desirable characteristics that are only occasionally found among available investments. The people were outstanding. Yet, small as the company was, it was not just one man who was making key contributions. In relation to competitors, the company was unusually strong, it was handling its business well, and it had in the offing enough new product lines with potentials that were large in relation to the then size of the company. Even if some of these products did not materialize, the future should be very bright with others. Zigging and zagging. However, to all this should be added something of equal importance if an investment is to prove a genuine bonanza. The largest profits in the investment field go to those who are capable of correctly zigging when the financial community is zagging. If the future of the Food Machinery Corporation had been properly appraised at that time, the profits that were to accrue to those who bought the shares in the 1932 to 1934 period would have been very much smaller. It was only because the true worth of this company was not generally recognized and Food Machinery was thought to be just another of the many flaky companies which were sold to the public at the height of a speculative orgy that it was possible to buy these shares in quantity at the ridiculous price to which they had sunk. This matter of training oneself not to go with the crowd but to be able to zig when the crowd zags, in my opinion, is one of the most important fundamentals of investment success. I wish I had the command of English to be able to describe adequately the degree of my internal, emotional, and intellectual excitement as I contemplated what this as yet financially unrecognized Food Machinery Corporation might do for both my tiny personal finances and for the infant business I was attempting to get started. My timing seemed right. Like a spring that had been compressed too far and was starting to recoil, the years from 1933 to 1937 were to see stocks as a whole advancing slowly at first, and then bursting into a full-bloom bull market, followed by a sizable break in 1938 and a full recovery the following year. With a deep conviction that food machinery would vastly outperform the market as a whole, I bought my clients every share that I was able to convince them to hold. I made the possibilities of this business the spearhead of my approach in talking to any potential clients I could reach. I felt that here was just the type of unique, almost once-in-a-lifetime, opportunity that Shakespeare so well described when he said, "There is a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune." In those exciting years when my hopes were high and both my purse and reputation in the financial community were almost non-existent, I quoted those exciting words to myself time and time again to stiffen my determination. Contrary, but correct. Much has been written in the literature of investments on the importance of contrary opinion. Contrary opinion, however, is not enough. I have seen investment people so imbued with the need to go contrary to the general trend of thought that they completely overlook the corollary of all this, which is, when you do go contrary to the general trend of investment thinking, you must be very, very sure that you are right. For example, as it became obvious that the automobile was largely to displace the streetcar and the shares of the once favored urban railways began to sell at ever lower price-earnings ratios, it would have been a rather costly thing just to be contrary and buy streetcar securities only on the grounds that because everyone thought they were in a declining stage, they must be attractive. Huge profits are frequently available to those who zig when most of the financial community is zagging, providing they have strong indications that they are right in their zigging. If a quotation from Shakespeare was a vital force in formulating my policies on the matter, so also, strangely enough, was a popular song from World War I. As one of the very thinning ranks of those who can still remember how the home front reacted in the stirring days of 1918, I might point out that in its excitement and enthusiasm for that war the American public had a naivete then quite different from its grimness about such matters in World War II, when the horrors of war were more clearly understood. First-hand news of the casualties and the filth and the terror of those in the front lines had not yet permeated the continental United States in 1918. As a result, the popular music of the day was filled with cheerful and humorous war songs in a way that happened on a much smaller scale in World War II, and not at all during the Vietnam fiasco. Most of these songs came out in the form of sheet music for pianos. One of these songs, published with a picture of a proud mama looking down on parading soldiers, had the title, "They're All Out of Step But Jim." I recognized from the very first that I was running a distinct risk of being out of step. My very early purchases of food machinery and a number of other companies were bought out of phase when their intrinsic merit was completely unrecognized by the financial community. I might be completely wrong in my thinking and the financial community could be right. If so, nothing would be worse for my clients or myself than letting my firm convictions about a particular situation lock up a sizable amount of funds unprofitably for an endless period of years because I zigged when the financial community had zagged, and I had been wrong in doing so. However, while I realized thoroughly that if I were to make the kinds of profits that are made possible by the process that I have described as zigging when the rest zags, it was vital that I have some sort of quantitative check to be sure that I was right in zigging. Patience and performance. With this in mind, I established what I called my 3-year rule. I have repeated again and again to my clients that when I purchase something for them, not to judge the results in a matter of a month or a year, but to allow me a 3-year period. If I have not produced worthwhile results for them in that time, they should fire me. Whether I have been successful in the first year or unsuccessful can be as much a matter of luck as anything else. In my management of individual stocks over all these years I have followed the same rule, only once having made an exception. If I have a deep conviction about a stock that has not performed by the end of 3 years, I will sell it. If this same stock has performed worse rather than better than the market for a year or two, I won't like it. However, assuming that nothing has happened to change my original view of the company, I will continue to hold it for 3 years. In the second half of 1955, I bought a substantial number of shares in 2 companies in which I had never previously invested. They proved to be almost a classic example of the advantages and problems of investing contrary to the currently accepted view of the financial community. Looking back, 1955 could be considered the beginning of a period of almost 15 years that might be termed the first golden age of electronic stocks. I am using the adjective first so that there can be no confusion in anyone's mind with what I believe will be considered the golden age for semiconductor stocks, something which I suspect lies ahead of us and will be associated with the 1980s. At any rate, in 1955 and immediately thereafter, the financial community was about to be dazzled by a whole series of electronic companies which were to show gains that by 1969 had reached truly spectacular proportions. IBM, Texas Instruments, Varian, Litton Industries, and Ampex are a few that come to mind. However, in 1955, all of that lay ahead. At that time, with the exception of IBM, all these stocks were considered highly speculative and beneath the notice of conservative investors or big institutions. However, sensing part of what might lie ahead, I acquired what for me were rather sizable positions in both Texas Instruments and Motorola during the latter parts of 1955. Today Texas Instruments is the largest worldwide producer of semiconductors, with Motorola running a close second. At that time, Motorola's position in the semiconductor industry was insignificant. It was no factor at all in causing me to buy the shares. Rather, I became impressed both with the people and with Motorola's dominant position in the mobile communications business, where an enormous potential seemed to lie, whereas the financial community was valuing it as just another television and radio producer. Motorola's subsequent rise in the semiconductor area, resulting at least in part from their acquiring the services of Dr. Daniel Noble, was all to come later and was additional icing on the cake not anticipated by me at the time of purchase. In the case of Texas Instruments, aside from an equally great liking and respect for the people, I was influenced by a quite different set of beliefs. I saw, as did others, a tremendous future that could be built out of their transistor business as the complexities of semiconductors were yielding to human ingenuity. I felt that those were people who could compete on at least even terms, and probably better than even terms, with General Electric, RCA, Westinghouse, and other giant companies despite the opinion of much of Wall Street. A number of people criticized me for risking funds in a small, speculative company, which they felt was bound to suffer from the competition of the corporate giants. After buying these shares, the near-term results in the stock market were quite different. Within a year, Texas Instruments had increased in value quite handsomely. Motorola fluctuated in a range from 5% to 10% below my cost of purchase. It performed sufficiently poorly that one of my major clients became so irritated by its market action that he refused to call Motorola by name. He only referred to it as, "that turkey which you bought me." These unsatisfactory quotations were to continue for moderately over a year. Yet as awareness of the investment significance of the communications arm of Motorola was to seep into the consciousness of the financial community, together with the first signs of a turnabout in the semiconductor area, the stock then became a rather spectacular performer. While I was buying Motorola, I was doing so in conjunction with a large insurance company that had let the Motorola management know that they were also interested in the conclusions of my first visit. Shortly after the insurance company too had bought a significant amount of Motorola stock, they submitted their entire portfolio to a New York bank for appraisal. With the exception of Motorola, the bank divided their portfolio into 3 groups: most attractive, less attractive, and least attractive. They refused to place Motorola in any category, however, saying this was not the type of company on which they spent time, therefore they had no opinion about it. Yet one of the officials of the insurance company told me over 3 years later that in the face of this rather negative Wall Street view, Motorola had by that time outperformed every other stock in their portfolio. If I had not had my 3-year rule, I might have been less firm in holding my own Motorola intact through a period of poor market action and of some client criticism. To every rule, there are exceptions. But not many. Have I ever sold stock because of this 3-year rule and then later wished I had not made this sale because of a subsequent major rise in the stock? Actually, There have only been a relatively small number of times when I have made a sale triggered by this 3-year rule and nothing else. This is not because there have been so few times that purchases made by me have failed to provide the major rise which was my purpose in initiating them. In the majority of such cases, further insights about the company opened up as I continued to investigate additional aspects of the situation, and these insights caused me to change my views about it. However, in those relatively few cases where it was the 3-year rule and only that which caused me to sell, I cannot recall a single case where subsequent market action caused me to wish I had held on to the shares. Have I ever violated my own 3-year rule? The answer is yes, exactly once, and this was many years later, toward the middle of the 1970s. 3 years before, I had acquired a moderately substantial block of shares in the Rogers Corporation. Rogers had expertise in certain areas of polymer chemistry, and I believed they were on the way to developing various semi-proprietary families of products which would show quite dramatic increase in sales, and not just for a year or two, but for many years. Yet, at the end of 3 years the stock was down, and so were the earnings of the company. Several influences were at work, however, which made me feel this was one time to ignore my own standards and to make this the exception that proves the rule. One of these influences was my strong feeling about Norman Greenman, the company's president. I was convinced he had unusual ability, the determination to see these matters through, as well as something else which I consider of great value to an intelligent investor, the kind of honesty that caused him not to conceal repeated bad news that could not fail but be embarrassing for him to tell. He saw to it that those interested in his company understood all the unfavorable aspects of what was happening, as well as the favorable potentials. There was another element which influenced me greatly. A major reason the company's profits were so poor was that Rogers was spending a quite disproportionate amount of money on a single new product development seeming to offer prospects of great results. This was diverting both money and people from other potentially exciting new products which were getting less corporate effort. New products of this type do have magnificent potential. When the painful decision was made to abandon all the effort on this one particular product, it was not long before it became quite apparent that several other innovations of great promise were starting to flower. All this, however, took time. In the meanwhile, the company's failure to live up to the hopes of many of those who had bought the shares caused the stock to drop to levels that were absurd in relation to its sales, its assets, or any type of normal earning power. Here seemed a classic example of zigging when the financial community was zagging. Therefore, 3-year rule or no, I sizably further increased my holdings and those of my clients, even though a few of those clients, influenced by the years of waiting and the negative performance, looked at this with a degree of apprehension. As so often happens in situations of this sort, when the turn came, it came fast. As it became apparent that the betterment of earnings was not a 1 or 2 year matter, but gave strong indications of being but the basis for years of genuine growth, the stock continued to rise proportionately. An experiment with market timing. All this, however, gets me years ahead of my story, because back in the 1930s there were other things I also had to learn through trial and error as my investment philosophy was gradually taking shape. In my casting around for ways to make money through common stocks, I began realizing that I might have a worthwhile byproduct from my study of the Food Machinery Corporation. Enough of their business was dependent on the fruit and vegetable canning industry so that in order to be reasonably sure I was right about my food machinery purchases, I had inadvertently learned a good deal about what influenced the fortunes of the fruit and vegetable canning companies themselves. This industry was highly cyclical because of both fluctuating general business conditions and erratic weather influences as they affected specific crops. As long as I was becoming somewhat familiar with the characteristics of the packing industry anyway, I decided I might as well try and take advantage of this knowledge, not through long-term investments, as I was doing with food machinery, but through in-and-out transactions in the shares of the California Packing Corporation, then an independent company and the largest fruit and vegetable canner. 3 different times, from the depths of the Big Depression to the end of that decade, I bought shares of this company. Each time, I sold them at a profit. Superficially, this might sound like I was doing something quite worthwhile. Nevertheless, when, For reasons I will explain shortly, I endeavored a few years later to analyze the wise and unwise moves I made in my business. It became increasingly apparent to me how silly these activities were. They took a great deal of time and effort that could well have been devoted to other things. Yet the total rewards in dollars in relation to the sums at risk were insignificant in comparison to the profits I had made for my people in food machinery and in other situations where I had bought for long-range gains and held over a considerable period of years. Furthermore, I had seen enough of in-and-out trading, including some done by extremely brilliant people, that I knew that being successful 3 times in a row only made it that much more likely that the 4th time I would end in disaster. The risks were considerably more than those involved in purchasing equal amounts of shares in companies I considered promising enough to want to hold them for many years of growth. Therefore, at the end of World War II, by which time much of my present investment philosophy was largely formulated, one had made what one believed was one of the more valuable decisions of my business life. This was to confine all efforts solely to making major gains over the long run. Reaching for price, foregoing opportunity. During the 1930s I learned, or at least partially learned, something else which I consider truly important. I have already mentioned my complete failure to benefit from my correct forecasts of the Great Bear Market which started in 1929. All the correct reasoning in the world is of no benefit in stock investment unless it is turned into specific action. My first experience in operating my own business occurred during the depth of the Great Depression, when very small amounts of money became of abnormal significance. Possibly because of this, or possibly because of my personal characteristics, as I started my business I found myself constantly battling for eighths and quarters. Brokers who knew much more than I did kept telling me if I believed that a stock would rise in a few years to several times its current price, it really made very little difference whether I acquired its shares at $10 or $10 1/4. Yet I continually placed limit orders with no better reason for a limit than a purely arbitrary decision on my part that I would pay, say, $10 and no more. Logically, this is ridiculous. I have observed it to be a bad investment habit that is deeply ingrained in many people besides myself, but not ingrained at all in others. The potential dangers of arbitrary limits were made clear to me as the result of a mistake of someone else. I remember as though it were yesterday running into one of my more important clients by chance on the sidewalk in front of a San Francisco bank. I told him that I had just come back from visiting the Food Machinery Corporation. The outlook was never so exciting, and that I thought he should buy some additional shares. He completely agreed with me and asked where the stock had closed that particular afternoon. I told him $30 1/2. He gave me a significant order and said he would pay $33 3/4 but no more. Over the next day or two the stock fluctuated in a range just fractionally above his bid. It never got down to it. I phoned him twice, urging him to go up 1/4 point so that I could buy stock. Unfortunately he replied, "No, that is my price." Within a few weeks the stock had risen over 50% and, after allowing for stock split UPS, never again in the company's history was it to come down to anywhere near where he could have bought it. This gentleman's actions made an impression on me that my own stupidity had not. Gradually, I was to overcome much of this weakness of mine. I am thoroughly aware that if a buyer desires to acquire a very large block of stock, he cannot completely ignore this matter of an eighth or a quarter, because by buying a very few shares he can significantly put the price up on himself for the balance. However, for the great majority of transactions, being stubborn about a tiny fractional difference in the price can prove extremely costly. In my own case, I have completely conquered it in regard to buying, but only partially in regard to selling. Within the past year, my placing a small sell order with a limit rather than at the market caused me to miss a transaction by exactly 1/4 point, with the result that, as I write this, the shares are now down 35% from where I placed my order. At levels only halfway between that limit order and current prices, I sold only part of this not very large holding. 3. The philosophy matures. Our entry into World War II was not entirely without some significance in the development of my investment philosophy. Early in 1942 I found myself in an unaccustomed role as a ground officer doing various business-related jobs for the Army Air Corps. For 3.5 years, I simply beached my business as I performed my not very valuable services on behalf of Uncle Sam. In recent years, I have frequently said that I did quite a job for my country. Neither Hitler nor Emperor Hirohito ever succeeded in getting a man into the territories I defended. These were Arkansas, Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska. At any rate, during this time of various desk-type jobs wearing Uncle Sam's uniform, I found that almost without warning I would alternate between two different types of periods. For a while, I would have so much to do that the last thing I would be able to think about was my peacetime business. At other times, I would sit at my desk with very little to do. When things were slow, I found it less unpleasant to analyze in great detail just how I would build up my business when the happy day that I would no longer be wearing a uniform might arise than it was to think of the personal living and army-type problems with which, from a short-range point of view, I was confronted. It was during such periods that my present investment philosophy took steadily more definite shape. It was then I decided there was not enough future in the type of in-and-out trading that I have described in the stock of California packing. During this period, I reached two other conclusions that were to be of some significance to my future business. Before the war I had served all types of clients, large and small, with varying types of objectives. Most, but not all, of my business had been focused on finding unusual companies that would enjoy significant, above-average growth in future years. After the war, I would limit my clientele to a small group of large investors with the objective of concentrating solely on this single class of growth investment. For tax reasons, growth was more likely to benefit these clients. My other major conclusion was that the chemical industry would enjoy a period of major growth in the post-war years. Therefore, a high-priority project on returning to civilian life was to endeavor to find the most attractive of the larger chemical companies and make this a major holding for the funds I was handling. I by no means spent 100% of my time doing this, but in the first year after restarting my business I did spend a rather considerable amount of time in talking to anyone I could find who had real knowledge of this complex industry. Such people as distributors who handled the lines of one or more large companies, professors in the chemical departments of the universities who had intimate knowledge of chemical business people, and even some of those in the major construction companies that had put up plants for various of the chemical producers all proved extremely worthwhile sources of background information. By combining these inputs with analyses of the usual financial data, it only took about 3 months to narrow the choices down to one of 3 companies. From there on, the going was slower and the decisions more difficult. However, by the spring of 1947 I decided that the Dow Chemical Company would be my choice. E pluribus unum. There were many reasons for the choice of Dow Chemical from the many promising chemical firms. I believe it might be worthwhile to enumerate some of them because they are clear examples of the type of things I seek in the relatively small number of companies in which I desire to place funds. As I began to know various people in the Dow organization, I found that the growth that had already occurred was in turn creating a very real sense of excitement at many levels of management. The belief that even greater growth lay ahead permeated the organization. One of my favorite questions in talking to any top business executive for the first time is what he considers to be the most important long-range problem facing his company. When I asked this of the president of Dow, I was tremendously impressed with his answer: it is to resist the strong pressures to become a more military-like organization as we grow very much larger, and to maintain the informal relationship whereby people at quite different levels and in various departments continue to communicate with each other in a completely unstructured way and, at the same time, not create administrative chaos. I found myself in complete agreement with certain other basic company policies. Dow limited its involvement to those chemical product lines where it either was or had a reasonable chance of becoming the most efficient producer in the field as the result of greater volume, better chemical engineering and deeper understanding of the product, or for some other reason. Dow was deeply aware of the need for creative research, not just to be in front, but also to stay in front. There was also a strong appreciation of the people factor at Dow. There was in particular a sense of need to identify people of unusual ability early, to indoctrinate them into policies and procedures unique to Dow, and to make real efforts to see if seemingly bright people were not doing well at one job, they be given a reasonable chance to try something else that might be more suitable to their characteristics. I found that although Dow's founder, Dr. Herbert Dow, had died some 17 years before, his beliefs were held in such respect that one or another of his sayings was frequently quoted to me. While his comments were directed primarily at matters within Dow, I decided that at least two of them were equally appropriate to my own business, in that they could be applied at least as well as to optimizing the selection of investments as to matters internal to the Dow Chemical Company. One of these was, never promote someone who hasn't made some bad mistakes, because if you do, you are promoting someone who has never done anything. The failure to understand this element by so many in the investment community has time and again created unusual investment opportunities in the stock market. The truly worthwhile accomplishment in the business world nearly always requires a considerable degree of pioneering, in which ingenuity has to be seasoned with practicality. This is particularly true when the gains are sought through leading-edge technological research. No matter how able the people are and no matter how good may be most of their ideas, there are times when such efforts are bound to fail, and fail dismally. When this happens and the current year's earnings drop sharply below previous estimates as the costs of the failure are added up, time and again the investment community's immediate consensus is to downgrade the quality of the management. As a result, the immediate year's lower earnings produce a lower than the historic price-earnings ratio to magnify the effect of reduced earnings. The shares often reach truly bargain prices. Yet if this is the same management that in other years has been so successful, the chances are the same ratio of average success to average failure will continue on in the future. For this reason, the shares of companies run by abnormally capable people can be tremendous bargains at the time one particular bad mistake comes to light. In contrast, the company that doesn't pioneer, doesn't take chances, and merely goes along with the crowd is liable to prove a rather mediocre investment in this highly competitive age. The other of Dr. Dow's comments which I have tried to apply to the process of investment selection is, if you can't do a thing better than others are doing it, don't do it at all. In this day of heavy-handed government intervention in so many types of business activities, of high taxes and labor unions, and of rapid shifts in public taste from one product to another, it seems to me that the risk of common stock ownership is seldom warranted unless it is confined to companies with enough competitive spirit constantly to be trying and frequently succeeding in doing things in a manner superior to industry in general. In no other way are profit margins usually broad enough to meet the demands of growth. This is, of course, particularly true during periods when inflation is having a significant effect in eating away at reported profits. History versus opportunity. There were some remarkable parallels between the period when I was starting my business at the depths of the Great Depression and during the years 1947 through the very early 1950s, when I was restarting it after a military service interlude of 3.5 years. Both periods were times when it was unusually hard to obtain immediate results for clients in the face of overwhelming general pessimism. Both were times that were to prove spectacularly rewarding for those who had the patience. In the earlier period, stocks were driven to perhaps the lowest level in relation to real value seen in the 20th century, not just because of the economic havoc wrought by the Great Depression, but also because prices were discounting the worry of many investors as to whether the American system of private enterprise would itself survive. It survived, and in the ensuing years the rewards of those able and willing to invest in the right stocks were fabulous. Just a few years after World War II, another fear kept stocks at levels almost as low in relation to intrinsic value as those seen at the depths of the Great Depression. This time, business was good and corporate earnings were steadily rising. Nevertheless, almost the entire investment community were mesmerized by a simple comparison. A relatively few years after the Civil War, a period of immediate prosperity was followed by the Panic of 1873, and almost 6 years of deep depression. A somewhat similar period of prosperity after World War I was followed by the crash of 1929 and the even deeper depression of about the same length. In World War II, the costs of war had run on a per diem basis about 10 times that of World War I. Therefore reasoned the dominant investment view of this period, current excellent earnings don't mean anything. They will be followed by a horrendous crash and a period of extreme adversity when all would suffer. Year after year went by, and the per-share earnings of more corporations rose. Along about 1949, this period became known as the era in which American business is worth more dead than alive, because as soon as word spread that a publicly owned company was about to go out of business, its shares would rise dramatically. The liquidating value of many a company was so much more than its current market valuation. Year followed year, and slowly it began dawning on the investment public that perhaps stocks were being held back because of a myth. The expected business decline never did arrive and, excepting for two relatively minor recessions in the 1950s, the stage was being set for the great rewards to long-term investors that were to follow. As I write these words in the closing weeks before the decade of the 80s is about to start, it amazes me that more attention has not been paid to rescuing the few years of stock market history that started in the second half of 1946 to see whether true parallels may actually exist between that period and the present. Now, for the third time in my lifetime, many stocks are again at prices which, by historic standards, are spectacularly low. In relation to reported book value, they may not be quite as cheap as they were in the post-World War II period. However, if that reported book value is adjusted for replacement value in real dollars, they may perhaps be cheaper than in either of the two prior, bargain value periods. The question arises, are the worries that are holding back stock values in the present period, such matters as the high cost of energy or the dangers from the political left or of overextended credit, with the inevitable resulting drain on the level of business activity as liquidity is restored, more serious and more apt to stop the future growth in this country than the fears that held back stock prices in these two prior periods? If not, once the problems of overextended credit have been solved, it might be logical to assume that the 1980s and period beyond may offer the same sort of rewarding opportunities that characterized the two former periods of abnormally low prices. Lessons from the vintage years. From a business standpoint, the 15 years from 1954 through 1969 were a magnificent time for me, as most of the relatively few stocks I was holding advanced significantly more than did the market as a whole. Even so, I managed to make some bad mistakes. Successes came from diligent application of the approaches I have already spelled out. It is the mistakes that are more noteworthy. Each brought its own new lesson. Good fortune can breed laxness. The mistake which now embarrassed me the most, although it was not the most costly, arose from the careless application of a sound principle. In the early 1960s, I had technological investments that were proving quite pleasing in the electronic, chemical, metallurgical, and machinery industries. I did not have a comparable investment in the promising drug field, and started seeking one. Along the way, I talked to a medical specialist who was preeminent in his field. At the time, he was tremendously excited about a new drug family about to be introduced by a small Midwestern manufacturer. These drugs he felt could have quite favorable impact on the future earnings of this firm relative to others in this field. The potential market seemed very, very exciting. I then talked to just one of the officers of this company and to only a few other investment people, all of whom were equally excited about the potentials of this new drug. Unfortunately, I did not pursue my standard checks either with other drug companies or with other experts knowledgeable in this particular specialty to see if they might have contrary evidence to offer. Regretfully, I subsequently learned, none of the proponents had made a thorough investigation either. The stock was selling at a price well above its worth before considering the benefits of this new family of drugs, but at a price which could have been but a minor fraction of potential value if the new drugs were all their supporters imagined. I bought the shares only to see them drop, at first a mere 20% and then over 50%. Ultimately the whole company was sold for cash at this low price to a large non-pharmaceutical corporation seeking to enter the drug field. Even at this price, now somewhat less than half of what I had paid for the shares, I subsequently learned that the acquiring company lost money on the deal. Not only did this new family of drugs fail to measure up to the extensive hopes that had been enthusiastically projected by my friend, the medical specialist, but also on painful post-mortem re-examination of the situation, I found that there were management problems in this small drug manufacturer. With a more thorough investigation, both failings would, I believe, have become apparent to me. From that embarrassing time forward, I have tried to be particularly thorough in making investigations in periods when things were going well. The only reason this particular investment folly wasn't more costly stemmed from my caution. Since I had had only a slight contact with the management, I made only a small initial investment, planning to buy more as I got to know the company better. Their troubles overtook me before I had a chance to compound my original folly. As the long bull market was reaching its final peak in 1969, another mistake occurred. To understand what happened, it is necessary to recreate the psychological fever which gripped most investors in technological and scientific stocks at that time. Shares of these companies, particularly many of the smaller ones, had enjoyed advances far greater than the market as a whole. During 1968 and 1969, only one's imagination seemed to cap the dreams of imminent success for many of these companies. Some of these situations did have genuine potential, of course. Discrimination was at a low ebb. For example, any company serving the computer industry in any way promised a future, many believed, that was almost limitless. This contagion spread into instrument and other scientific companies as well. Up to this time, I resisted the temptation to go into any of the similar companies that had just gone public at very high prices in the previous year or two. Yet, being in frequent contact with those who were sponsoring these excitement-inducing companies, I kept looking for a few that might be genuinely attractive. In 1969, I did find an equipment company working in an extremely interesting new frontier of technology, one that had a real basis for its existence. The firm was run by a brilliant and honest president. I can remember still, after a long luncheon session with this man, my pacing up and down the airport awaiting my airplane home and trying to determine whether I should buy this company's shares at the prevailing market. After considerable deliberation, I decided to go ahead. I was right in diagnosing the potential of this company, for it did grow in the years that followed. Nevertheless, it was a poor investment. My mistake lay in the price I paid to participate in the promise. Some years later, after the company had shown rather respectable growth, I sold these shares, but at a price very little different from my original cost. While I believe I was right in selling when I thought the company had reached a point where its future growth was considerably more uncertain, nevertheless selling an investment at a meager profit after it has been held for a number of years is not the way to make capital grow or even protect it against inflation. In this case, disappointing performance was the result of being seduced by the excitement of the times into paying an unrealistic initiation price. Do few things well. A policy judgment that was wrong for me engendered quite a different kind of mistake, and one which did cost a significant amount of dollars. My mistake was to project my skill beyond the limits of experience. I began investing outside the industries which I believe I thoroughly understood, in completely different spheres of activity, situations where I did not have comparable background knowledge. When it comes to manufacturing companies that serve industrial markets or to companies on the leading edge of technology that are serving manufacturers, I believe that I know what to look for where both the strong points and pitfalls may lie. However, different skills proved important in evaluating companies making and selling consumer-type products. When the products of competitive companies are essentially rather similar to one another, and when changes in market share depend largely on shifting public tastes or on fashions greatly influenced by the effectiveness of advertising, I learned that the abilities which I had in selecting outstanding technological companies did not extrapolate to the point where I could identify what produces unusual success in real estate operations. Others may do well in quite diverse investment arenas. Perhaps, unlike the other types of mistakes I have made during my business career, this one should properly be ignored by others. Nevertheless, an analyst must learn the limits of his or her competence and tend well the sheep at hand. Stay or sell in anticipation of possible market downturns. Should an investor sell a good stock in the face of a potentially bad market? On this subject, I fear I hold a minority view given the investment psychology prevalent today. Now more than ever, the actions of those who control the vast bulk of equity investments in this country appear to reflect the belief that when an investor has achieved a good profit in a stock and fears the stock might well go down, he should grab his profit and get out. My view is rather different. Even if the stock of a particular company seems at or near a temporary peak and that a sizable decline may strike in the near future, I will not sell the firm's shares provided I believe that its longer-term future is sufficiently attractive. When I estimate that the price of these shares will rise to a peak quite considerably higher than the current levels in a few years' time, I prefer to hold. My belief stems from some rather fundamental considerations about the nature of the investment process. Companies with truly unusual prospects for appreciation are quite hard to find, for there are not too many of them. However, for someone who understands and applies sound fundamentals, I believe that a truly outstanding company can be differentiated from a run-of-the-mill company with perhaps 90% precision. It is vastly more difficult to forecast what a particular stock is going to do in the next 6 months. Estimates of short-term performance start with economic estimates of the coming level of general business. Yet the forecasting record of seers predicting changes in the business cycle has generally been abysmal. They can seriously misjudge if and when recessions may occur, and are worse in predicting their severity and duration. Furthermore, neither the stock market as a whole nor the course of any particular stock tends to move in close parallel with the business climate. Changes in mass psychology and in how the financial community as a whole decided to appraise the outlook either for business in general or for a particular stock can have overriding importance and can vary almost unpredictably. For these reasons, I believe that it is hard to be correct in forecasting the short-term movement of stocks more than 60% of the time, no matter how diligently the skill is cultivated. This may well be too optimistic an estimate. On the face of it, it doesn't make good sense to step out of a position where you have a 90% probability of being right because of an influence about which you might at best have a 60% chance of being right. Moreover, for those seeking major gains through long-term investments, the odds of winning are not the only consideration. If the investment is in a well-run company with sufficient financial strength, even the greatest bear market will not erase the value of holding. In contrast, time after time, truly unusual stocks have subsequent peaks many hundreds of % above their previous peaks. Thus, risk/reward considerations favor long-term investment. So, putting it in the simplest mathematical terms, both the odds and the risk/reward considerations favor holding. There is a much greater chance of being wrong in estimating adverse short-term changes for a good stock than in projecting its strong, long-term price appreciation potential. If you stay with the right stocks through even a major temporary market drop, you are at most going to be temporarily behind 40% of the former peak at the very worst point and will ultimately be ahead, whereas if you sell and don't buy back, you will have missed long-term profits many times the short-term gains from having sold the stock in anticipation at a short-term reversal. It has been my observation that it is so difficult to time correctly the near-term price movements of an attractive stock that the profits made in the few instances when this stock is sold and subsequently replaced at significantly lower prices are dwarfed by the profits lost when timing is wrong. Many have sold too soon and have either never gotten back in or have postponed reinvestment too long to recapture the profits possible. The example I will use to illustrate this point is the weakest one I have experienced. In 1962, two of the major electronics investments I had made had risen to heights that made the outlook for near-term price movement extremely dangerous. Texas Instruments was selling at over 15 times the price I had paid for it 7 years before. Another company which I bought a year or so later, and which I shall call by the fictitious name of Central California Electronics, had enjoyed a similar percentage rise. Prices had gone too far. I consequently informed each of my clients that the prices of these two stocks were unrealistically high and discouraged them from using these prices in measuring their current net worth. This is a practice I have rarely followed, and then only when I had an unusually strong conviction that the next important move for one or more of my stocks would be sharply downward. Nevertheless, in the face of this conviction, I urged my clients to maintain their holdings, in the belief that some years ahead both stocks would rise to very much higher levels. When the correction in values came for these two stocks, it proved even more severe than I had anticipated. Texas Instruments at its subsequent bottom sold off 80% from its 1962 peak. Central California Electronics did not perform quite so badly, but still sold off by almost 60%. My beliefs were being tested in the extreme. However, within a few years Texas Instruments was once again selling at new high levels, more than double its 1962 high. Patience had paid off here. Central California Electronics' performance was not a happy one. As the general stock market started to recover, problems within the management of Central California Electronics became apparent. Changes in personnel occurred. I became quite worried and made what I believe was a thorough investigation. I reached two conclusions and neither one pleased me. One was that I had misjudged the former management. I should have been more aware of its deficiencies, yet wasn't. Neither could I be sufficiently enthusiastic about the new management to warrant continuing to hold the shares. I consequently sold these holdings in the following 12-month period at a price only slightly better than half of the 1962 peak. Even so, my clients, depending on the applicable purchase price, gained from 7 to 10 times the original cost. As I have already indicated, I am deliberately citing a weak example rather than a dramatic one to illustrate why I believe it pays to ignore near-term fluctuations in situations that hold real promise. My error in the Central California Electronics instance was not in holding the shares through a temporary decline, but in something far more important. I had grown too complacent as a result of the enormous success of my investments in this company. I began paying too much attention to what I was hearing from top management and not doing sufficient checking with people at lower levels and with customers. When I recognized the situation and acted upon it, I was then able to make the same kind of gains I had expected to make in Central California Electronics by switching these funds to other electronic companies, chiefly Motorola, which fortunately rose in the next few years to a value several times higher than the prior peak of Central California Electronics. In and out may be out of the money. There is more to learn from the Texas Instruments and Central California Electronics situations. When I originally acquired these Texas Instruments shares in the summer of 1955, they were bought for the longest type of long-range investment. It seemed to me the company fully warranted this degree of confidence. About a year later, the stock had doubled. With one exception, the various owners of the funds I managed, familiar as they were with my method of operations, showed no more interest in taking a profit than did I. However, at that time I had one relatively new account owned by people who, in their own business, were used to building up inventory when markets were low and cutting it back sharply when they were high. Now that Texas Instruments had doubled, they brought strong pressure to sell, which for a time I was able to resist. When the stock rose an additional 25% to give them a profit of 125% of their cost, the pressure to sell became even stronger. They explained, "We agree with you. We like the company, but we can always buy it back at a better price on a decline." I finally compromised with them by persuading them to keep part of their holding and sell the rest. Yet when the big drop occurred several years later and the shares fell 80% from their peak, this new bottom was still almost 40% higher than the price at which this particular holder was so eager to sell. After a very sharp advance, a stock nearly always looks too high to the financially untrained. This client demonstrated another risk to those who follow the practice of selling shares that still have unusual growth prospects simply because they have realized a good gain and the stock appears temporarily overpriced. These investors seldom buy back at higher prices when they are wrong and lose further gains of dramatic proportions. At the risk of being repetitious, let me underscore my belief that the short-term price movements are so inherently tricky to predict that I do not believe it possible to play the in-and-out game and still make the enormous profits that have accrued again and again to the truly long-term holder of the right stocks. The long shadow of dividends. In these comments I have tried to show how, as the years have passed, various experiences gradually helped to shape my investment philosophy. However, looking back, I find no specific event, either a mistake or a favorable opportunity, which caused me to reach the conclusions I have on the matter of dividends. Many observations over a long period of years gradually crystallized my views. I started out taking for granted the belief, as widely accepted 40 years ago as it is today, that dividends were something highly favorable to the stockholder and something which should be welcomed enthusiastically. Then I began seeing companies that had so many exciting-looking new ideas flowing from their research departments that they could not capitalize upon them all. Resources were too scarce or too expensive. I began thinking how much better it might be for some stockholders if, instead of paying dividends, more of the company's resources were retained and invested in more of these innovative products. I began increasingly to recognize that the interests of all stockholders were not identical. Some investors needed dividend income to support their lifestyle. These stockholders would undoubtedly prefer current dividends to greater future profits and increased value for their shares resulting from increased investment in promising products and technologies. These investors could find investments in firms whose needs and opportunities for productive use of capital were not too demanding. But how about the stockholder whose earning power or other income sources exceeded needs and who was regularly saving money anyway? Would it not be better for this investor if the company passed up its dividends, which would often be subject to a fairly high income tax rate, and instead reinvested the funds, tax-free, in future growth? Shortly after World War II, when one started concentrating my investment activities almost solely on the attainment of major, long-range capital appreciation, another aspect of the dividend payout issue became even more apparent. The companies with the greatest growth prospects were under tremendous pressure to pay no dividends at all. Their need for funds and their ability to use funds productively was too large. The cost of developing these new products was just the first heavy drain on capital needed to finance growth. There followed the heavy marketing expense needed to introduce them to the customer. With success, plant expansion was needed to service a growing volume. Once the new line was on its way, there were further capital requirements for the increased inventories and accounts receivable which, in most cases, grow almost in direct proportion to the volume of the business. There seemed a natural fit of interest between those firms with bountiful investment opportunities and certain investors who sought to make the greatest possible profit in relation to the risk involved and who neither needed additional income nor wanted to pay unnecessary taxes. Such investors should, I believe, mainly confine investments to non-dividend paying companies with strong earning power and with attractive places to reinvest their earnings. These were the clients I sought to serve. Recently, however, the situation has become less clear-cut. Institutional holders have become an increasingly dominant force in day-to-day stock transactions. Institutions such as pension and profit-sharing funds pay no income tax on their dividends. Many of them as a matter of policy will not invest in a company unless it pays some dividend, no matter how small. Attracting and holding these buyers have caused many companies with unusual prospects to initiate modest dividend payments of rather small percentage total annual earnings. Managers of some would-be growth companies have concurrently reduced their payout dramatically. Today, the skill in investing retained earnings wisely has become a more critical factor in separating the unusual company from the pack. For these reasons, I have come to believe that the most that can be said on this subject of dividends is that it is an influence that should be downgraded very sharply by those who do not need the income. In general, more attractive opportunities will be found among stocks with a low dividend payout or none at all. However, so general is the feeling among those who determine dividend policies that paying out dividends is beneficial to the investor that occasionally I have found truly attractive opportunities among higher dividend payout companies, although this has not happened very often. 4. Is the market efficient? By the coming of the 1970s, nearly all of my investment philosophy was firmly in place, molded by my experience of 4 prior decades. It is not coincidence that with only one exception all of both the wise and the foolish actions I have mentioned as examples that helped form the background of this philosophy were incidents that occurred during these 4 prior decades. This does not mean that I have made no mistakes in the 1970s. Unfortunately, it seems that no matter how much I try, sometimes I must stub my toe more than once in the same way before I truly learn. However, in the examples I have used, I usually took the first instance when a particular type of event happens to illustrate my point, which explains why all but one of the examples I used occurred during these earlier periods. It might be helpful to notice the striking parallels in each of these past 10-year periods. With the possible exception of the 1960s, there has not been a single decade in which there was not some period of time when the prevailing view was that external influences were so great and so much beyond the control of individual corporate managements that even the wisest common stock investments were foolhardy and perhaps not for the prudent. In the 1930s there were years when this view, influenced by the Great Depression, was at its most extreme, but perhaps not any more than the fear of what the German war machine and World War II might do in the 1940s, or the certainty that another major depression would hit in the 1950s, or fear of inflation, hostile government actions, etc., in the 1970s. Yet every one of these periods created investment opportunities that seemed almost incredible. With all the advantages of hindsight. In each of these 5 decades there were not a few, but many common stock opportunities that 10 years later yielded profits running to many hundreds of % for those who had bought and stayed with the shares. In some instances profits ran well into the thousands of %. Again, in every one of these 5 decades some stocks which were the speculative darlings of the moment were to prove the most dangerous kind of trap for those who blindly followed the crowd rather than those who really knew what they were doing. All of these 10-year periods essentially resembled the others in that the greatest opportunities came from finding situations that were extremely attractive but that were undervalued because at that particular moment the financial community had significantly misjudged the situation. As I look back on the various forces that buffeted the securities market over this 50-year period and at the great waves of public optimism and pessimism that succeeded each other over this time span, the old French proverb, plus c'est change, plus c'est la même chose, comes to mind. I have not the slightest doubt that as we enter the emerging decade of the 1980s, with all the problems and the prospects that it now offers, the same will continue to hold true. The fallacy of the efficient market. In the last few years, too much attention has been paid to a concept that I believe is quite fallacious. I refer to the notion that the market is perfectly efficient. Like other false beliefs in other periods, a contrary view may open up opportunities for the discerning. For those unfamiliar with efficient market theory, the adjective efficient does not refer to the obvious mechanical efficiency of the market. A potential buyer or seller can get his order to the market where a transaction can be executed very effectively within a matter of a couple of minutes. Neither does efficiency refer to the delicate adjustment mechanism which causes stock prices to move up or down by fractions of a point in response to modest changes in the relative pressure of buyers and sellers. Rather, this concept holds that at any one time the market efficient prices are assumed to reflect fully and realistically all that is known about the company. Unless someone has some significant, illicit inside information, there is no way genuine bargains can be found. Since the favorable influences that make a potential buyer believe that an attractive situation exists are already reflected in the price of stock. If the market was as efficient as it has become fashionable to believe, and if important opportunities to buy or significant reasons to sell were not constantly occurring, stock returns should not subsequently have the huge variations that they do. By variation, I am not referring to changes in prices for the market as a whole, but rather the dispersion of relative price changes of one stock against another. If the market is efficient in prospect, then the nexus of analysis that leads to this efficiency must be collectively poor. Efficient market theory grew out of the academic school of random walkers. These people found that it was difficult to identify technical trading strategies that worked well enough after transactions costs to provide an attractive profit relative to the risks taken. I don't disagree with this. As you have seen, I believe that it is very, very tough to make money with in and out trading based on short-term market forecasts. Perhaps the market is efficient in this narrow sense of the word. Most of us are or should be investors, not traders. We should be seeking investment opportunities with unusual prospects over the long run and avoiding investment opportunities with poorer prospects. This has always been the central tenet of my approach to investments in any case. I do not believe that prices are efficient for the diligent, knowledgeable, long-term investor. Directly applicable to this is an experience I had in 1961. In the fall of that year, as in the spring of 1963, I undertook the stimulating duty of substituting for the regular finance professor and teaching the senior course of investments at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. The concept of the efficient market was not to see the light of day for many years to come and had nothing to do with my motivation in the exercise I am about to describe. Rather, I wanted to show these students in a way they would never forget that the fluctuations of the market as a whole were insignificant compared to the differences between the changes in price of some stocks in relation to others. I divided the class into two groups. The first group took the alphabetical list of stocks on the New York Stock Exchange, starting with the letter A. The second group, those starting with the letter T. Every stock was included in alphabetical order. Each student was assigned 4 stocks. Each student looked up the closing prices of the last day of business of 1956, adjusted the stock dividends and stock splits, and compared this price with the prices of Friday, October 13th. The percentage increase or decrease that occurred in each stock over this period of almost 5 years was noted. The Dow Jones averages rose from 499 to 703, or by 41% in this period. Altogether, there were 140 stocks in this sample. The results are displayed in the following table. These data are quite insightful. In a period when the Dow Jones averages rose 41%, 38 stocks, or 27% of the total, showed a capital loss. 6 of them, or 4% of the total, recorded a loss of over 50% of their total value. In contrast, roughly 1/4 of the stocks realized capital gains that would have been considered spectacular. To drive the point home, I noted that if a person invested $10,000 in equal amounts in the 5 best stocks on this list, at the outset of this 4¾ year period, his capital would now be worth $70,260. On the other hand, if he had invested the $10,000 in the 5 worst stocks, his capital would have shrunk to $3,180. These extreme results were most unlikely. It would take luck, either good or bad, as well as skill, to hit either of these extremes. It would not be so implausible for a person with real investment judgment to have picked 5 out of the 10 best stocks for his $10,000 investment, in which case his net worth on Friday the 13th would have been $52,070. Similarly, some investors consistently select stocks for the wrong reasons and manage to pick lemons. For them, selecting 5 out of the 10 poorest in performance is also not an entirely unrealistic expectation of results. In that case, the $10,000 investment would have shrunk to $4,270. On the basis of this comparison, there might be, in less than 5 years, a difference of $48,000 between a wise and an unwise investment program. A year and a half later, when I also taught this same course, I repeated the exact same exercise, with the exception that instead of using the letters A and T, I selected 2 different letters in the alphabet from which to form the sample of stocks. Again, over a 5-year time frame, but with a different starting and a different closing date, the degree of variation was almost exactly the same. Looking back on most markets of 5-year duration, I believe that one can find stock performance results that are about as disparate. Some of this dispersion may come as the result of surprises, important new information about a stock's prospects that could not be reasonably foreseen at the outset of the period. Most of the differences, however, can be anticipated at least roughly, both in terms of direction and general magnitude of gains and losses relative to the market. The Raychem Corporation. In view of this kind of evidence, it is hard for me to see how anyone can consider the stock market efficient, again using the word efficient as it is used by the proponents of this theory. But to belabor the point further, let me take a stock market situation of just a very few years ago. In the early years of the 1970s, The shares of the Raychem Corporation had considerable prestige in the marketplace and were accordingly selling at a relatively high price-earnings ratio. Some of the reasons warranting this prestige may be perceived by some comments made by the company's executive vice president, Robert M. Halperin. In outlining what he called the 4 cardinal points to Raychem's operating philosophy, he stated, 1. Raychem will not do anything technically simple. 2. Raychem won't do anything unless it can be vertically integrated, that is, Raychem must conceive the product, manufacture it, and sell it to the customer. 3. Raychem won't do anything unless there is a substantial opportunity for real proprietary protection, which generally means patent protection. Unless this occurs, research and development energies will not be employed on a project, even though otherwise it might fit into Raychem's skills. 4. Raychem will only go into new products when it believes it can become the market leader in whatever niche, sometimes smaller, sometimes larger, that product attempts to capture. By the mid-1970s, awareness of these unusual strengths was sufficiently prevalent among those who controlled large institutional funds so that sizable blocks of shares had been taken out of the market by people who believed that Raychem was a situation of unusual competitive strength and attractiveness. However, it was another aspect of this company that gave Raychem its greatest appeal to these holders and was probably the cause of the high price-earnings ratio at which it was then selling. Many considered that Raychem, which was spending an above-average percentage of sales on new project development, had perfected a research organization capable of producing an important enough stream of new products so that the company could be depended on to show an uninterrupted upward trend in sales and profits. These research products had quite justifiably a special appeal to the financial community because many of the newer ones only indirectly competed with older products of other companies. Primarily, the new products enabled high-priced labor to do the same job in considerably less time than had previously been required. There were enough savings offered to the ultimate customer of these products to justify a price which should afford Raychem a pleasing profit margin. All this caused the stock toward the end of 1975 to reach a high of over $42.5, a level about 25 times the estimated earnings for the fiscal year ending June 30, 1976. Raychem dashed expectations and the crash. Toward the close of the June 30, 1976, fiscal year, Raychem was hit by 2 hammer blows, which were to play havoc with the price of the stock and with the company's reputation in the financial community. The financial community had become very excited about a proprietary polymer, Stillin, which enjoyed unique advantages over other compounds used by the airplane industry for coating wire and which was then in the final research stages. Furthermore, the polymer was to be the first product in which Raychem would go basic, that is, make the original chemicals in its own plant rather than buying raw materials from others and compounding them. Because of the appeal of the product, Raychem had allocated by a considerable margin more funds to this research product than to any other in its history. The financial community assumed this product was already on its way to success, and after passing through the usual learning curve experienced by all new products it would become highly profitable. Actually, quite the opposite was occurring. In the words of the Raychem management, Stillin was a scientific success but a commercial failure. Improved products of an able competitor, while technically not as desirable as Stillin, proved adequate for the job and were far cheaper. Raychem management recognized this. In the course of a relatively few weeks, management reached the painful decision to abandon the product and write off the heavy investments made in it. The resulting charge to earnings for that fiscal year was some $9.3 million. This charge-off caused earnings, exclusive of some offsetting special gains, to drop to $0.08 a share from $7.95 the previous fiscal year. The financial community was as much upset by the erosion of the great confidence in the company's research ability as by the precipitous drop in earnings. Largely ignored was the basic rule that some new product developments are bound to fail in all companies. This is inherent in all industrial research activity and in a well-run company is far more than offset in the long run by other successful new products. It may have been just bad luck that the particular project on which the most money had been spent had been the one to fail. At any rate, the effect on the stock price was dramatic. By the fourth quarter of 1976, the stock had dropped to a low of approximately $14.34 or to approximately $0 net hurt its former high. Of course, only a tiny amount of stock could be bought or sold at the low point for the year. Of greater impact, the stock was available at prices only moderately above this low level for months thereafter. Another development also affected the profits of the company at this moment and contributed to Racham's fall from favor. One of the most difficult tasks for those responsible for the success of any growing company is to change the management structure appropriately as the company grows to allow for the difference between what is needed for proper control of small companies and optimum control of big companies. Until the end of the 1976 fiscal year, Racham management had been set up along divisional lines based largely on manufacturing techniques, that is, on the basis of the products produced. This worked well when the company was smaller, but was not conducive to serving the customer most efficiently as the company was growing. Therefore, at about the end of the 1975 fiscal year, top Racham management started working on a big company management concept. The firm restructured the divisions by the industry served rather than by the physical and chemical composition of the products being manufactured. The target date to make the change was set at the end of the 1976 fiscal year. This was done at a time when there was not the least thought within the management that this date would coincide with the time of the huge write-off for the abandonment of Stillen. Everyone in Racham knew that when the organizational change was to occur there would be at least one quarter and probably a minimum of two of substantially reduced earnings. While making these changes caused almost no change in the individuals on the Racham management payroll, so many people now had different superiors, different subordinates, and different co-workers with whom they had to interface their activities that a time of inefficiency and adjustment was bound to occur until Racham employees learned how best to coordinate their work with the new faces with whom they were now dealing. Perhaps no stronger indication could have existed to justify long-range confidence in this company or to indicate that management was not concerned with short-term results than its decision to go ahead with this project as planned rather than to postpone what was bound to be a second blow to Racham's current earnings. Actually, this significant change worked with considerably less difficulty than had been anticipated. As expected, the first quarter earnings of the new fiscal year were much lower than would have been the case if the change had not been made. However, the change was working so well that as the second quarter progressed, the short-term costs of what had been done had largely been eliminated. Fundamentally, these developments should have been considered bullish by analysts. Racham was now in a position to handle growth properly in a way that could not have been done before. It had successfully hurdled a barrier of the type that is most apt to dull the luster of otherwise attractive growth companies. By and large, the financial community did not seem to recognize this, however, and instead the temporary further shrinkage of earnings was just one more factor holding the stock at the low levels to which it had fallen. Making these price levels even more attractive to potential investors was another influence that I have seen happen in other companies shortly after they had abandoned a major research project that had proved unsuccessful. One financial effect of the abandonment of Stillen was that a sizable amount of money that had heretofore been devoted to that project was now free to be allocated elsewhere. Even more important, it had similarly freed the time of key research people for other endeavors. Within a year or two, much like a field of flowers starting to bloom when rain follows drought, the company began to enjoy what was possibly a greater number of attractive research projects in relation to its size than had ever before been experienced. Racham and the efficient market. Now, what has Racham's situation to do with this theory of an efficient market that has recently gained such a following in certain financial quarters? According to that theory, stocks automatically and instantly adjust to whatever is known about a company, so that only those who might possess illicit, inside information that is not known to others could benefit from what might lie ahead for a particular stock. In this instance, at the drop of a hat, the Racham management would and did explain to anyone interested all the facts I have just cited and explained how temporary they believed was the period of poor earnings. Actually, well, after all this had happened and when profits were climbing to a new all-time high level, the Racham management went even further. On January 26, 1978, they held a long one-day meeting at their headquarters which I had the privilege of attending. Racham management invited to this meeting the representatives of all institutions, brokerage houses, and investment advisors who either had any interest in Racham or they thought might have. At this meeting, the 10 most senior executives of Racham explained with what I believe was extreme frankness and in detail, such as I have only occasionally seen at similar meetings of other companies, the prospects, the problems, and the current status of Racham matters under their jurisdiction. In the year or two following this meeting, Racham's earnings growth developed exactly as might have been inferred from what was said there. During that period, the stock was to much more than double from the price of $23.14 at which it was selling that day. Yet in the weeks immediately following this meeting, there was no particular effect on the stock whatsoever. Some of those present were obviously impressed by the picture being presented. Too many, however, were still under the influence of the double shock that they had experienced a year or two before. They obviously mistrusted what was being told them then. So much for the theory of an efficient market. What kind of conclusion does the investor or the investment professional reach from experiences like Racham? By and large, those who have accepted and been influenced by this theory of the efficient market fall into two groups. One is students, who have had a minimum of practical experience. The other, strangely enough, seems to be many managers of large institutional funds. The individual private investor, by and large, has paid relatively little attention to this theory. From this experience gained in applying my personal investment philosophy, I would conclude that in my field of technological stocks, as the decade of the 1970s comes to an end, there would therefore be more attractive opportunities among the larger companies, the market for which is dominated by the institutions, than among the small technological companies where the individual private investor plays a considerably bigger role. Just as some 10 years earlier those who recognized the folly of the then prevailing concept of the two-tier market benefited from recognizing that particular nonsense for what it was, so in each decade false ideas arise creating opportunities for those with investment discernment. Conclusion. This then is my investment philosophy as it has emerged over a half-century of business experience. Perhaps the heart of it may be summarized in the following 8 points. 1. Buy into companies that have disciplined plans for achieving dramatic long-range growth in profits and that have inherent qualities making it difficult for newcomers to share in that growth. There are so many details, both favorable and unfavorable, that should also be considered in selecting one of these companies that it is obviously impossible in a monograph of this length to cover them adequately. For those interested, I have attempted to summarize this subject as concisely as I could in the first 3 chapters of Conservative Investors Sleep Well. A brief outline appears in the appendix. 2. Focus on buying these companies when they are out of favor, that is, when, either because of general market conditions or because the financial community at the moment has misconceptions of its true worth, the stock is selling at prices well under what it will be when its true merit is better understood. 3. Hold the stock until either there has been a fundamental change in its nature, or it has grown to a point where it no longer will be growing faster than the economy as a whole. Only in the most exceptional circumstances, if ever, sell because of forecasts as to what the economy or the stock market is going to do, because these changes are too difficult to predict. Never sell the most attractive stocks you own for short-term reasons. However, as companies grow, remember that many companies that are quite efficiently run when they are small fail to change management style to meet the different requirements of skill big companies need. When management fails to grow as companies grow, shares should be sold. For those primarily seeking major appreciation of their capital, to emphasize the importance of dividends. The most attractive opportunities are most likely to occur in the profitable, but low, or no dividend payout groups. Unusual opportunities are much less likely to be found in situations where high percentage of profits is paid to stockholders. 5. Making some mistakes is as much an inherent cost of investing for major gains as making some bad loans is inevitable in even the best run and most profitable lending institution. The important thing is to recognize them as soon as possible, to understand their causes, and to learn how to keep from repeating the mistakes. Willingness to take small losses in some stocks and to let profits grow bigger and bigger in the more promising stocks is a sign of good investment management. Taking small profits in good investments and letting losses grow in bad ones is a sign of abominable investment judgment. A profit should never be taken just for the satisfaction of taking it. 6. There are a relatively small number of truly outstanding companies. Their shares frequently can't be bought at attractive prices. Therefore, when favorable prices exist, full advantage should be taken of the situation. Funds should be concentrated in the most desirable opportunities. For those involved in venture capital and quite small companies, say with annual sales of under $25 million, more diversification may be necessary. For larger companies, proper diversification requires investing in a variety of industries with different economic characteristics. For individuals, any holding of over 20 different stocks is a sign of financial incompetence. 10 or 12 is usually a better number. Sometimes the costs of the capital gains tax may justify taking several years to complete a move toward concentration. As an individual's holdings climb toward as many as 20 stocks, it nearly always is desirable to switch from the least attractive of these stocks to more of the attractive. It should be remembered that ERISA stands for emasculated results, insufficient sophisticated action. 7. A basic ingredient of outstanding common stock management is the ability neither to accept blindly whatever may be the dominant opinion in the financial community at the moment nor to reject the prevailing view just to be contrary for the sake of being contrary. Rather, it is to have more knowledge and to apply better judgment, in thorough evaluation of specific situations, and the moral courage to act, in opposition to the crowd, when your judgment tells you you are right. 8. In handling common stocks, as in most other fields of human activity, success greatly depends on a combination of hard work, intelligence, and honesty. Some of us may be born with a greater or lesser degree of each of these traits than others. However, I believe all of us can grow our capabilities in each of these areas if we discipline ourselves and make the effort. While good fortune will always play some part in managing common stock portfolios, luck tends to even out. Sustained success requires skill and consistent application of sound principles. Within the framework of my 8 guidelines, I believe that the future will largely belong to those who, through self-discipline, make the effort to achieve it. Appendix. Key factors in evaluating promising firms *. My philosophy calls for making a relatively small number of investments but only in unusually promising companies. Obviously, I am looking for signs of growth potential in the companies I study. As important, I am trying, through my analysis, to avoid risk. I want to make sure that the firm's management has the wherewithal to capitalize on the potential and to minimize my investment risks in the process. Summarized below are some of the defensive characteristics that I search for in the companies that are to meet my standards of unusual promise when I undertake financial analysis, interviews with management, and discussions with informed people associated with the industry. Functional factors. 1. The firm must be one of the lowest cost producers of its products or services relative to its competition, and must promise to remain so. A comparatively low break-even will enable this firm to survive depressed market conditions and to strengthen its market and pricing position when weaker competitors are driven out of the market. B. A higher than average profit margin enables the firm to generate more funds internally to sustain growth without as much dilution caused by equity sales or strain caused by overdependence on fixed income financing. 3. Effective marketing requires not only understanding of what customers want, but also explaining to them in terms the customer will understand. Close control and constant monitoring of the cost/effectiveness of market efforts are required. 4. Even non-technical firms today require a strong and well-directed research capability to produce newer and better products, and perform services in a more effective or efficient way. 5. There are wide differences in the effectiveness of research. 2 important elements of more productive research are market/profit consciousness, and the ability to pool necessary talent into an effective working team. 6. A firm with a strong financial team has several important advantages. A good cost information enables management to direct its energies toward those products with the highest potential for profit contribution. B. The cost system should pinpoint where production, marketing, and research costs are inefficient even in subparts of the operation. C. Capital conservation through tight control of fixed and working capital investments. 2. A firm must have a strong enough customer orientation to recognize changes in customer needs and interests and then to react promptly to those changes in an appropriate manner. This capability should lead to generating a flow of new products that more than offset lines maturing or becoming obsolete. 7. A critical finance function is to provide an early warning system to identify influences that could threaten the profit plan sufficiently ahead of time to devise remedial plans to minimize adverse surprises. A PPENDIX. People factors. 1. To become more successful, a firm needs a leader with a determined entrepreneurial personality combining the drive, the original ideas, and the skills necessary to build the fortunes of the firm. 2. A growth-oriented chief executive must surround himself with an extremely competent team and to delegate considerable authority to them to run the activities of the firm. Teamwork, as distinct from dysfunction struggles for power, is critical. 3. Attention must be paid to attracting competent managers at lower levels and to training them for larger responsibilities. Succession should largely be from the available talent pool. The need to recruit the chief executive from outside is a particularly dangerous sign. 4. The entrepreneurial spirit must permeate the organization. 5. More successful firms usually have some unique personality traits, some special ways of doing things that are particularly effective for their management team. This is a positive, not a negative sign. 6. Management must recognize and be attuned to the fact that the world in which they are operating is changing at an ever-increasing rate. Every accepted way of doing things must be re-examined periodically, and new, better ways sought. B. Changes in managerial approaches involve necessary risks, which must be recognized, minimized, and taken. 7. There must be a genuine, realistic, conscious, and continuous effort to have employees at every level, including the blue-collar workers, believe that their company is really a good place to work. Employees must be treated with reasonable dignity and decency. B. The firm's work environment and benefits programs should be supportive of motivation. C. People must feel they can express grievances without fear and with reasonable expectation of appropriate attention and action. D. Participatory programs seem to work well and be an important source of good ideas. 8. Management must be willing to submit to the disciplines required of sound growth. Growth requires some sacrifice of current profits to lay the foundation for worthwhile future improvement. Business characteristics. 1. Although managers rely heavily on return of assets in considering new investments, investors must recognize that historic assets stated at historic costs distort comparisons of firms' performance. Favorable profit-to-sales ratios, notwithstanding differences in turnover ratios, may be a better indicator of the safety of an investment, particularly in an inflationary environment. 2. High margins attract competition, and competition erodes profit opportunities. The best way to mute competition is to operate so efficiently that there is no incentive left for the potential entrant. 3. Efficiencies of scale are often counterbalanced by the inefficiencies of bureaucratic layers of middle management. In a well-run firm, however, the industry leadership position creates a strong competitive advantage that should be attractive to investors. 4. Getting there first in a new product market is a long step toward becoming first. Some firms are better geared to be there first. 5. Products are not islands. There is an indirect competition, for example, for consumers' dollars. As prices change, some products may lose attractiveness even in well-run, low-cost companies. 6. It is hard to introduce new, superior products in market arenas where established competitors already have a strong position. While the new entrant is building the production, marketing power, and reputation to be competitive, existing competitors can take strong defensive actions to regain the market threatened. Innovators have a better chance of success if they combine technology disciplines, example electronics and nucleonics, in a way that is novel relative to existing competitive competencies. 7. Technology is just one avenue to industry leadership. Developing a consumer franchise is another. Service excellence is still another. Whatever the case, a strong ability to defend established markets against new competitors is essential for a sound investment.